whole purpose of the Singleness conversation is that you can have some amazing conversations in your churches and also in your life groups or connect groups. And we've just got one segment left, and I kind of want to go, Kira, a little bit more sort of, ask you some more questions about yourself, because we've talked about singleness being perceived negatively, but when we've chatted, particularly over the last couple of months, you've actually been really positive about your singleness, and I'd love to hear a bit more about your journey into that sort of place of positivity.
Yeah, I think we all I've definitely been on a bit of a journey in discerning what the kind of assumptions are, I suppose, that I had picked up along the way. As I think so often most of us do, it's like there is this kind of expectation of like you're on a life journey and these are the milestones that you hit. And then when you don't, and those are the questions that people start asking. It's like, oh, you haven't seen somebody for a long time, or you at some kind of reunion, the very first thing people often ask is, are you married, and things like that. And then when you're having to come up with those answers. And so I had to do a bit of a deep dive into, okay, well, how do I actually feel about this? And what was really, really helpful for me was discerning what is the external pressures that I'm feeling from other people, and it's kind of always that's just what you do is you get married, and if you're not, there's something wrong. And actually, how do I really feel about it? It was really helpful, because I kind of feel actually if I take away all of the kind of pressures and what you see and the expectations, I love my life. I'm feeling pretty good. And that was really freeing for me to kind of separate some of those things out. And then seeing the amazing amount of like freedom, opportunities that I have being single, particularly with what I do. Actually, it's ironic because, you said like a lot of sort of Anglican clergy, the expectation is that you're married, but I just found there's so many opportunities. Like I think in the future, I don't feel particularly called to singleness. I don't feel particularly called to marriage, as in like, desperate for marriage. But I do know that where I am now, or being single, affords so many opportunities and for the kingdom, if you see what I mean, like doing that kind of work that I might not be able to do if I then got married and had children or whatever it is. And it's just different. It's not better or worse. It are different opportunities in different stages of life. I think the other really big question is that I've had to look at is, what are the things that I am thinking, or that, for example, a good question to ask is, what are you thinking that being married will fill, like a sort of a hole or a role will fill, and if you're not married, how can you fill that in another way? Because often is if you're looking for marriage to solve a problem, or for example, if you're lonely, or if you're all of these things, or if there's just an expectation, I want to be able to say I'm married because it's like I feel some kind of weird, I don't know, sometimes it's like a shame about being single when I'm talking, people ask me about it. Then there's some work to do, discipleship-wise, and like I need to do some work with Jesus around, I'm looking for marriage to fill a hole that only actually Jesus, or only getting close to him, can fill, really.
I always see his sort of marriage analogies. People sort of say, oh, you're one half of a broken vase on the table, and there's another half of a broken vase over here, and the Lord will like bring together both halves of the broken vase, and then they'll like come together and be a whole vase, and then the Holy Spirit will pour in like water from the top and fill the vase, and it will still leak a bit and that will bless other people. That's what marriage is like. And you can see now everyone in the room's going, so I'm basically, up until this point in my life, I've been like half a broken vase lying on the table, waiting to be completed. Actually like thinking, no, marriage is like 2 smashed vases lying on the table and someone pours water over the top. That's it. Like that, that's the end. Of course, marriage is great, but let's get away from those kind of ideas that you're, I hear this sort of language a lot, when married people say things like, oh, you complete me, and there's sort of all these sort of smoky ideas, and even the one is a really unhelpful idea. Actually you're sort of compatible with millions of people. And of course, when you marry someone, you always describe them as the one. You wouldn't get any, you'd be in terrible trouble. Can you imagine going home and said, I could have been married to anyone, love, you're just one of many. Of course, like as soon as you get married as a Christian, you believe in that like it's free will until the point you get married, and afterwards then it's predestination. So of course you just describe it as the one, but then single people hear that language and they're like, oh wow, the one, there's a sort of destiny, and there's
got to wait for God to bring the one or whatever. It's just not
There's really unhelpful language that really creates more of this idea that your singleness is sort of a lesser status. It's lovely to hear you talking about your singleness as a gift, as an opportunity, and also just hear your sort of settlement in it. It's just really helpful to hear it right now.
I think if you're looking for a relationship to fill, what are you looking for that relationship to fill or complete? Because it won't. It really, if you're being brutally honest.
Yeah.
And you have to do and it's not like, I'm not saying do the work on yourself, because you all need to do work on yourself to get married. No, it's we all have to work at getting closer to Jesus, looking at that. And it's like our identity as to who we are has to be whole, has to be rooted in him before we think about adding another person into the mix. And if that, and I think, yes, there's a whole other level of conversation that we can have around, that we could have, and I'm sure you've had around dating, around really healthy relationships and things in church, but we can't look at that to solve a problem or fix something or to achieve, marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I as I say, sort of working in marriage and dating, the dating area, it's a lot about sort of revelation of what we need to work on in order to be a great marriage partner. And actually, in some ways, marriage is about having an overspill of love for someone else, but not about the worst. The relationships that really break down, and when you're sort of like you're a vortex wanting to draw love in to heal that inner that inner space. And I guess wanting to encourage a sort of confident narrative around singleness in the church. Just say, it's great to be in a church with single and married people of all ages and stages of life, and that you can all make an incredible contribution to the fabric of the church in different ways, and in some ways in very similar ways. But the relationship status doesn't determine that either way.
Yeah, and I think really quickly, super practically, I think some of the really helpful things that I found in talking to some of my other single friends are there are certain things that are going to be a little bit tougher to do as a single person, regardless of how you feel about being single or why you're single. And some of those are, perhaps big life events or weddings or just celebrating. I found like celebrating like real big wins or milestones, or the opposite. And often it's like a married person, or at the end of the day, can go home and share that with their spouse without too much effort. It's like there's a person there, which is great, who I can debrief with. But it's like, okay, so where are those areas where I find that a little bit more tricky? And then putting really practical things in place. Like I know if I've got something big coming up, it's like, afterwards, for me, it's like if I've got a big preach, but that won't be for everybody, or it could be a big event at work or something like a presentation. Have I put something in for later that night? Who am I gonna intend? You do have to be more intentional. It's like, who am I gonna put that diary date in with a really good friend or my really good married couple friends who I know that I can debrief with. And I just have those people and say like, oh, I really need to come over for a glass of wine. And they're like, yeah, come on over. Our house is always open. Or let's go out for dinner after this big thing. It's just a couple of times that I've been caught out kind of coming home to an empty house where it's like, oh no, I need to be proactive about being healthy, getting those healthy habits in for myself, taking care of myself, which is, I found, just really helpful. It's like you can fulfill a lot of those roles that sometimes a spouse might fill with other people by being really intentional about it. And people love doing it as well.
That's super helpful advice, Kira. Thank you. And again, I think just from the marriage point, just to point out as well, and this is a conversation which I quite often have when people say there's a sort of convenience of companionship in marriage, like you'll come home and your spouse will be waiting with their ear just peaked, just ready to listen to you really deeply for half an hour and like massage your toes and give you wine. Just again, helping single people to get away from that idea that actually there's a lot of loneliness in marriage and there's a lack of listening in married marriages. Now, obviously, we're all working in the marriage ministry to try and help people to grow relationships where there is high empathy, high engagement, careful listening. But if there's one area of marriage which is probably the one that comes up most predominantly as an issue in marriage over the long haul, it's a lack of listening and a lack of emotional availability. So whilst I'd encourage all of you who are single to think about practically who could I talk to about big life events, also for married couples, you might also want to think about that too, because it might not be your spouse, who's the person you want to celebrate with, necessarily after a big event. Or you might want to tee up your spouse to be awake and ready to listen when you come in from that major event. But just to help to level the ground again, the assumption that married people have this kind of the convenience of companionship, it's a nice idea, and I wish it was more available, but it's not as available as you might anticipate. And we all have to be kind of proactive in sharing our stories with one another as a community, beyond our microcosmic relationships across all of the age groups, because we've all got a story to share, and that's what's so powerful about being a faith community, is that God has given us all a story to share with him and with one another. We're going to get you to have another conversation